I'm delighted to be here, and I was lucky to have a small Baltic tour yesterday because my plane was delayed, and that meant that I had to first fly to Helsinki, then go to Tallinn, and then to Riga. So I've never seen so much of the Baltic Sea in my life, I suppose. But let me go to the core of the argument, and a lot of stuff has already been said. I just wanted to react to Yannis, his discussion previously, for instance, about mapping of European projects. We in Italy, actually, at the Italian agency where I coordinate a research team, we are effectively with our human force, as Yannis said it, scrutinizing a whole bunch of participations in Erasmus, but also in Horizon and other EU funding type of stuff on participation, so we will make some results available in the future. But let me get to the core of my keynote today, and that is exactly the dimension of participation. And I have to admit, I hate to bring also a little bit of bad news, and I will explain what this means in a second. And you can already see it, I think. Oh, my slides are not on the screen. I can see them here, but that would be, there they are. You can already see it a little bit from the outline of my talk. That is, we are, as Susanna, the head of the Latvian agency, said it so well in her opening talk, we are in turbulent times, meaning that we can't really only think about we have to communicate EU values, we have to talk about EU values together, etc. But we also have to think about in which ways these EU values are under stress, are indeed under attack in some cases, to put it very explicitly. And that means, as you can see in the second part of my talk, I will briefly talk about what some would call autocratic sentiments, or types of understanding what our societies are about, what politics is about, what democracy is about, that tends towards what I would see ways of interpreting values that are actually in contrast with European values. So we need to do something with that, and that's luckily where my talk will become a little bit more positive and constructive again. That means that we probably need to think very careful and rethink very careful about how we are doing European education, how we are doing Erasmus, and how do we instill participation into Erasmus Plus projects. And so a kind of big project in European citizenship education. I'm delighted, by the way, about what Yannis said about that there will be a real legal basis to participation as a core component of Erasmus Plus. And that brings me also to linking this to digital dimensions, where again, I have to, I think, bring a little bit of bad news. I don't think that digital participation is merely about good things. And let me share also a little bit more a personal note here, something I do by now anytime I talk to students, I give classes, or I talk to audiences like this. I use my keynotes, my lectures, for a kind of psychoanalysis, a kind of healing sessions. Because a lot of the things that I've been for decades been teaching seem to become much more complex nowadays than they were before. To give you a very clear-cut example, active participation, and we saw it a little bit in the video, I thought. I found it, in that sense, it was a peculiar video, because active participation can also mean people participating, promoting very aggressive, authoritarian, non-inclusive, indeed respective values towards all kinds of groups in our societies. And so that's why I'm saying, I'm seeing this also a little bit as a kind of psychoanalysis. That is, I have to teach my students democracy, participation, etc. But then I also bump into very difficult questions about, well, sometimes we see very active participation, but it doesn't really help the cause. And so our main concern, and here I come a little bit more constructive again, is how do we deal with those types of participation? How can we actually in Erasmus try to steer young people and others towards forms of participation that are more healthy, that are more inclusive, that are in line with the European values? So I try to summarize it here a little bit. European values are under threat for a whole bunch of reasons. That includes lesser formal participation, like voting, for instance, of young people. It includes, indeed, as I mentioned already, digital instruments may be sometimes actually used for very problematic purposes. We all know that, for instance, AI is increasingly also feeding into fake news, fake images, etc. And again, returning to my own, I was sitting on the higher education table because I'm a university professor, my own little world. In my own little world, most of my colleagues, including myself, are desperate because so-called generative AI, ChatGPT and other things, are taking over our lives. I get 90% of the student papers I get are more or less fabricated with ChatGPT. And in 80% of those cases, that means that what I receive is gibberish, is stuff that is hardly readable, is not up to the par of what a higher education paper in a course should look like. So that's also a threat. That's a threat in all kinds of ways for developing critical thinking skills, for learning as students, as adults, etc. There's also indeed a shift, and we see that in all kinds of societies throughout Europe, towards more appreciation of authoritarian values. And we'll come back to talk about that in a second. What does that mean? It's, in that sense, very simple. Authoritarian ideas are much more popular now than they were like 10, 20 years ago. And this is in many ways, I think, in contrast with those EU values, those European values that we would want to promote. And so my basic argument today is we need to be explicit about this, acknowledge this, and feed it into our own work. How do we deal with this? How can we, even if only on a tiny scale, get some people out of the manipulative sphere of, for instance, radical right ideas, etc., and get them back into thinking about democracy as something inclusive, that respects all minorities and all those people out there and that want to have their say, as we also saw in the video. But this is not an easy task, I have to say. I notice this in my own work as a professor of political sociology in Bologna in Italy. I also know it from a kind of shadow life I live, that is as a kind of democratic activist working with European democratic associations. And so we need then to get our head around of how do we think and use ideas of democratic engagement, participation, in a way that people indeed become active in the right way in social, local, but also broader political environments. And so, yeah, well, again, that brings me to a dimension that I think we should all acknowledge. There are clear indications in different dimensions that indeed not everything goes well. I've said this on other occasions already. What is striking in the last year's European parliamentary elections is that less young people came out, to focus a little bit on young people, to vote. And so that's something we have to factor in. Why is that? Maybe we can help there a little bit in the future. In our Italian Erasmus agency, we actually developed a survey to try to invite people to vote. A lot of other organizations did this as well on the European, on national levels, etc. Apparently, this was not sufficient, so maybe we need to rethink this a little bit. I'm already organizing another survey. Maybe that will do in time for the next parliamentary elections. Let's see. I can't promise anything. And so this also means we need to really think a little bit how we look at participation. For instance, with the European elections in 2019, there was a lot of optimism because so many young people came out to vote. There was a boost in young people coming out to vote. They also voted in a direction that a lot of people thought was in the right way regarding the European integration project. But in 2024, 5 years later, it looked very different. Less people coming to vote, so apparently not interested or not able. I mean, we've also tried to understand this a little bit in a survey. We'll do this in the future. Why didn't people go to vote? But more to our concerns today is, in some cases, in particular in major member states like France and Germany, we saw a lot of young people voting for parties that explicitly attack the European Union. And I don't need to name names here. Anyone familiar with the political context in France and Germany will know what parties I'm talking about. And so this is also something to factor in. So those that did vote, then in France and Germany, around a third of young people between roughly 15 and 25 years of age, or 16, 15 you can't vote, of course, but 16, yes, in Germany, they voted for parties that are actually clearly against the European Union as it is. So this is something to factor in. On the photo on the right, by the way, you see, this is a bit of an exaggeration maybe, but this was a radical right protest in the Netherlands, in The Hague, just a couple of weeks ago, where a lot of young people very angrily. That made me also think of the video where I thought also the participation was a bit maybe too forceful in some ways. And a fun fact is maybe that today in the Netherlands there's national elections, and political scientists in the Netherlands have already showed, also in prior elections, that a lot of young people, proportionally more young people, vote for radical right parties. And this will probably be confirmed today in the Dutch elections. Another fun fact that's not on the slide maybe is that I was luckily already able to vote. I live in Italy, but I'm still a Dutch citizen, so I voted by mail. And that's something we should also, I think, reinforce much more in the future. Make it easy for European citizens who don't live in their member states to vote also in national elections. And so what we see here is an increasingly visibility, presence of parties and other political organizations in the European public sphere, in the European political sphere, in the European political institutions that promote ideas that are clearly in contrast with the European project as it was originally set up. This is about the European Union's values, but this is also, I think, about the first steps of European integration in the 1950s, which was a lot about we don't want ever to go back to the atrocities, to the drama of the Second World War. And so this is something not to be forgotten, I suppose, and it's something to be factored in. But returning to the story of young people, ever more we see in research emerging that young people seem to be, at least part of them, shifting towards ideas that I would call sort of autocratic, authoritarian sentiments that I think, at least in part, are in strong tension with the European project. And in some ways then, as some Dutch research, for instance, has shown, and I also read an article this morning in a Dutch newspaper that re-articulated this, is that young people nowadays seem to be closer in their value setup to what their grandparents think or thought than to the values of their own parents. And I'm a parent myself, so I'm continuously thinking about what am I doing wrong? So far, my kids seem to be okay, but they can't vote yet, so I have to verify that in the future. And so we got important problems to deal with here. If we focus on young people, but of course the argument here is not only young people. This is a broader trend across populations in European Union member states and also in accession states, indeed. And so, as you see here, very recent research on a very interesting data set, which is called the European Election Survey. So where a couple of researchers, political scientists maybe, dived very deeply into what happened in the European elections last year. And they show in their research with some 29,000 or so young people in all European member states, that young people tend to be politically more disaffected. They don't feel included in democratic politics. They feel that democratic politics is not about them. They are less attached to mainstream classical political parties. And maybe the most problematic part is they're less committed to the idea of liberal democracy. And I think most of us will agree the European values that are so clearly stated in Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union, they have a strong spirit of liberal democracy. So if increasingly people, including young people, tend not to care anymore for liberal democracy, we clearly have a problem. So yeah, no, I forgot to mention, we actually have two problems in this sense. Less people formally participating in voting, as you can see on the right of the slide, and then also young people, but also more broadly speaking, are increasingly interested, convinced, manipulated into, maybe we could say, endorsing values that are in contrast with the whole idea of European integration. And so we have to think about this carefully. And again, I stress young people because psychological research points out, and I'm not sure to what extent this is entirely true, but it's something to think about, is that we, all of us, our sort of political attitudes, the way we stand politically, etc., the way we stand in our societies as citizens, we form most of our ideas that we keep with us for the rest of our lives, between 15 and 25 years of age. So what happens in that time span in our lives is probably going to be decisive for what happens in our life afterwards, in terms of what kind of political stance we take, how we vote, how we politically and socially look at issues like inclusion, tolerance in our societies, etc. It makes me personally very nervous because, I mean, I've got a responsibility as a university professor where most of my students are in that age group. My sons are 13 and 70 years of age, so one of them is already in that critical time span. It's something to deeply think about. And so that's one part of the story. Another fact that we increasingly hear coming out of research is that young men in this day and age are apparently more interested in, let's say, authoritarian, radical right ideas than young women. And so we see a kind of split between gender in terms of where and how democratic political issues are understood by young people. I'm not sure what to make of this, but it's something to factor in for sure. What does this mean? How does this come? What can education do about these types of forms of really peculiar polarization? So this is the research I already mentioned before, which in fact shows, as you can see, the numbers are impressive, some 26,000 respondents all over Europe. All European member states are involved in this analysis, in this survey, and it shows that young people tend to be indeed more interested in, for instance, voting for radical right parties than other age groups. You can, I don't need to go into the nitty-gritty details of how do you know, how you can measure this, what kind of questions do you ask. In this survey, they took two questions basically, you could say related to the rule of law, and in a very complex way they talk about the independence of the judiciary, so how independent are judges and courts in our society in the system of justice. And then the second one is maybe more easy to grasp, and that is, are people in favor or not a strong leader? And that is most of the times asked in a way that we ask, would you think that in certain circumstances, rather than having complex democratic compromises and debates, it would be better to have a strong leader? And they take these components then to indeed investigate, are young people more interested in, let's say, autocratic ideas than other age groups? And here, in these graphs, it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear that the age group, which I can't really read, I can read it from here, below 25 years of age, is much more interested in dimensions, let's say, of autocratic ideas, if we accept that you can measure them in this way. So, is it important to support independent courts? Or am I in favor or against a strong leader? And in both cases, we see that young people are much more inclined towards what you could call autocratic ideas. This one indeed looks at support for far-right parties. Here we see a bit of a overlap, I suppose, between younger people and middle-aged people. By now, I suppose I'm getting close to the older compartment, but it's impressive to see the sort of the propensity, the interest in certain ideas that, I repeat, are autocratic in many ways. We'll come back to that in a second, which also almost automatically means that they defy European values, defy the European integration project as a project as such. And so it should then be noted that we see an authoritarian trend. Other research shows other things, of course, but there's too much research now, I think, that is credible and that shows an inclination of at least, let's say, a fourth or a third of young people being interested in sort of what some would call illiberal ideas, autocratic ideas, etc. That doesn't mean, indeed, if it's 1/3, that the other ones are of the same idea. Of course, young people are very versatile. A lot of them go into very different directions. And here you have a nice example, I think. If I'm not mistaken, this is the youngest member of European Parliament in the current parliament, Lena Schilling from Austria, Green Party, 23 or maybe by now 24 years of age. And I found an interview with her, indeed, where she says some things that are feeding directly into what we want to do as well. That is, we need to have young people all over Europe working on improving the European Union. We need to commit to indeed creating connections that overcome national difficulties. We need to combat phenomena such as racism and sexism. But then she says something else that I find very important, and we'll come back to this, and that is, I'm also realizing that other people might think about this in a different way. I mean, of course, we are in a Europe that is diverse. It's united, but there are many different groups, different countries, where different ideas are being promoted. So she also stresses that, well, I've got my view, but I always need to be aware of the fact that there are other views out there. And I think that's at least a starting point for thinking about, okay, we see tendencies, let's call them authoritarian, that we don't necessarily like, but we need to engage with it in one way or the other, even if it's sometimes very difficult. And so what are these autocratic sentiments then? I think to make it very simplified in a way, but it may help us to think a little bit with more clarity, is indeed that you could say autocratic ideas tend to be in contrast with what you could call a civic culture. A civic culture probably being at the basis of how we normally understand the values of the European Union. And here you see your standard citation of the Treaty on European Union, Article 2. We don't talk about Article 2 every day, unless some of you is a lawyer here. Lawyers talk an awful lot about this Article 2, particularly European Union law experts. And this is indeed, it's in a way a list, but it's a very important list. It's a European Union founded on human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality of the rule of law and human rights, non-discrimination, including rights for minorities, etc. I believe in many ways you can read this as reflecting the core of a civic culture. Those components that we think we should, I think, articulate in our different walks of life, in adult education, in voluntarism, in higher education, in schools, etc. And so this is what we try to make real, so to put it, in our projects that try to stimulate participation. The thing is, of course, what is that other thing then that is emerging? And again, I sometimes put things a little bit in a psychoanalytical way. This is something I'm thinking very hard about myself, also in terms of how can I do research on this. And so one set of works I came across is by a German sociologist, and he has coined already a long time ago a bit of a weird sounding term, but I think it does do the trick. He calls it either raw or crude bourgeoisie, which is basically a set of values that is in contrast with some of the core values of the civic culture I just mentioned. And so the civic culture at the basis of Article 2, the European values. It poses, as he says it, a threat to social integration. It tends to promote aggressive forms of polarization, and it even is grounded, as he sees it, in forms of misanthropy, so certain forms of hatred or disrespect for groups in our society. And these are, of course, heavy words, but we shouldn't put our heads in the sand, I would say. We need to think very carefully about what is going on here. What kind of ideas are people promoting? And particularly if it's also young people who will at later stages, maybe in their career, etc., become policymakers, politicians, etc. That is a scary scenario if you think about it. So the raw bourgeoisie promotes authoritarian ideas, natural hierarchies, is often against rights for women, equality between men and women, equality between minority groups in our societies. And so it puts a lot of emphasis on a kind of natural way of understanding hierarchies in our societies, and where it criticizes liberalism, the civic culture, for destroying those natural hierarchies. And so there are a number of components in this type of thinking that I think we see occur all various times in this type of non-civic ideas and culture. So a discontent for weak groups, a strong emphasis, I want to keep my privileges, and that can mean you're part of the elites, but it can also mean you're part of the lower social classes in society, where you argue the same thing, but then against migrants, against those that you think take up your housing, your jobs, etc. So there's an ideology, you could call this, of inequality rather than of equality, rather than of inclusion, rather than of making everybody part of what you could see as a kind of safe space spanning European society. And so that's something to think about very carefully. Again, I'm not saying that this is simply about a revolt of lower educated classes at the lower end of social economic income, etc. That's clearly not true. There's a lot of research that also shows that this type of sentiment, let's call it the autocratic sentiment, we find in different walks of life, in different groups, even amongst, indeed, university professors. and I do a lot of research on things like populism like that, I'm always amazed, and I hope not to offend anyone, but that there's an enormous amount of higher educated law professors that join, let's say, the populist, illiberal, autocratic sort of side of politics. And I don't know what it means, I have to say. Maybe I find it out somewhere in the future. So these raw and uncivil attitudes can be related then to a number of components that I think we need to think carefully about when we craft our own projects of participation. And as I said, it's a bit for me this psychoanalytical session. That's for a number of reasons. That is, in my teaching, I find it increasingly difficult because, for instance, of ChatGPT, etc. Find it difficult to deal with that. That's a turbulence, I think, in higher education. But the other turbulence is clearly, how do you teach things like democracy, liberal civil society, etc., in these circumstances where you increasingly see people articulating ideas that are in contrast with liberal types of democratic values. And so I increasingly have students that question things that I say, which is very nice, but I don't always have a response. For instance, like one of the core questions is, I think maybe in previous speeches this was a bit papered over, that is, civic participation can also mean participate civically, but with uncivic, illiberal messages. And so what do I tell my young students then? Go and participate, civil society is wonderful, etc. But I know, for instance, that also, for instance, in Italy, the extreme right, connected to extreme right terrorists in the 1970s, has been very active in setting up associations to defend its ideas, etc. I find it very difficult to deal with, but it's something I think we need to somehow factor in. So to come back to this sort of indications of what autocratic ideas might be about, it's indeed, as I said, and I find this in all kinds of stuff that I do research on, it's about hierarchy. There's a strong stress on, there's a natural hierarchy that needs to be accepted. It's very patriarchal most of the times. It's very unfriendly towards all kinds of minority groups, against certain sexual identities, etc. There's a strong emphasis, and I call it here conservative values, but in reality in my research I tend to call it radicalized conservative values that look at society in a specific way. And if you put, for instance, European integration into the mix, they would claim European integration is undermining or maybe even destroying our traditional way of life. And so that's why it's problematic. And so we need to have rather a Europe of nation states rather than a strong European Union. And so conservative values with certain ideas about specific groups in society with a strong emphasis on hierarchy, and indeed a strong emphasis on forms of leadership, authoritarian leadership, where democratic checks and balances are not seen as so dramatically useful and important. And well, I mean, in sociology, that's my discipline, this is nothing new. There have been really very important sociologists doing a lot of work on this. Here you see a table that comes from a book from Jeffrey Alexander, an American sociologist. In this book, which is called The Civic Sphere, he investigates the human rights struggles in the United States until, let's say, the early 21st century. So the book doesn't discuss Trump or anything yet, because that wasn't yet in the picture. But it was already clearly indicating, and that's what this table is about, a continuous struggle between what you could call civil values and uncivil or anti-civil values and relations. And I think this could be useful for us where we look at, we probably want to promote the left part of the table, right? So open relationships based on trust, on inclusion, certain types of critical attitude, an attitude of altruism, solidarity with the weaker groups in our societies, and so on and so forth. But it's also good to keep in mind that there's this other side that takes a very different picture and that promotes very different ideas and tries to convince us that, for instance, solidarity with migrants is bad because we need to promote our own group. Like in the Netherlands currently, some parties on the right are continuously talking about how the Netherlands is being overwhelmed by particularly Islamic migrants, and we need to get rid of them. And that's literally what one of the political leaders has said. To give you an interesting data point, the Dutch Statistical Office of the government indicated that the number of Muslim migrants in the Netherlands between early 2000s and today has increased by 0.3% or so. So where radical right then continuously talks about we're being invaded, etc., actual data shows a very different picture. And that's something to think about as well. But let's get to some, indeed, other research. And increasingly, by the way, you will find surveys, reports with particularly also young people and how they think about democracy, which may be a very useful starting point for us, I think. And so this one actually comes from the Pew Center, which is an American research center, which does really interesting stuff. And it includes a high number of European countries as well. Maybe this is not yet an alarming picture, but we can see that in some of our countries, also in Europe, like in the UK or Poland, some fourth, so some around 20%, 25% of young people think that autocracy, so the forms of dictatorship, are maybe not such a bad idea. Other research puts it in a slightly different question. So do you think that democracy is still the best form of government? Again, you could take this in the half full or half empty glass of wine. Half full would be say, well, there's still a majority of people being very actively pro-democracy, but there's also a gray part, for instance, where people are not so clearly pro-democracy, and then in the pinkish, in the dark pinkish side, they are actually particularly in favor of something else. So that's something to think about. Here's another research by the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung in Germany, or no, this is actually another one for the TUI Foundation, where they say indeed there is an important part of young people, in this case, in these between 16 and 26, that see autocratic forms of government as preferable, as something that we better test out in practice. We can discuss this all together, but I find this a scary scenario, I have to say. And I think we see it in some countries, not necessarily in Europe, where this plays out on a daily basis. And I think we can agree probably that probably would mean that many of the EU values we just talked about in Article 2 are becoming increasingly threatened, are increasingly in danger. This one is maybe a bit of a scary one, because at least it took me a while before I understood this graph. But the most important part is that, as you can see on the right side, there's sort of gray bar that's the highest. So that's around, I guess, 20-something% of young people being against migration, thinking we should heavily restrict migration, and also being, and that's the blue dot high up on the right, sympathetic to people who make strong claims against migration. So this could be an indication of people who don't have an inclusive idea of our societies, right? And so, yeah, I realize maybe we should take a break now, because this is in some ways a bit heavy, right? This is a bit bleak. It's not something that, well, it makes you jump up and down. Well, some people would jump up and down, yeah, and please do so if you want to, but this doesn't make me tick in the morning if I think about this, like, wow, another new bright day. Let's go to work and tell my students how lovely things are democracy-wise. So yeah, we can take a break, but we can also start slowly getting into a mood like, what to do? How can we take this up? And again, I feel the responsibility, I have to say. I think most of us will be on the exact same page here, a core factor, to put it mildly, is education. Also because, I mean, at least I can see this in my older son, 70 years old. We can't trust parents or we can trust parents maybe, but our children increasingly rebel. So anything daddy says is wrong. So it's difficult for me to at least educate my own children, but maybe at the university in Bologna, I might do something about this, right? And indeed, as I found in one a research project on this, you could say education is crucial in shaping future narratives that uphold the resilience of democratic foundations. You could also say that uphold the resilience of European Union values. So this is also in a way to say, let's make our mission a little bit more prominent, more important. I mean, Yannis said it. The legal basis in the Erasmus program is there. It will probably be okayed by the council. A legal basis, maybe to you, sounds like very vague stuff, but this is important. This is of high importance. It shows also that European institutions, the European Union institutions, are very aware of that there's a battle to be fought in many ways. And so what does this mean? Well, to give us at least some forms of orientation, at least what I use in my teaching as well, is we need to strongly promote critical thinking. That also means directly engaging with those hierarchical, autocratic ideas and discuss them. And think about what is it about them that attracts people, what is it that makes them indeed important for people, but also how could we, in one way or the other, persuade people that this is maybe problematic and this might actually undermine our societies. This might undermine our collective happiness. So critical thinking is super important. What is also important, you almost get here a bit to a collective psychoanalytic dimension, is critical self-reflection. To be always aware of the limitations of our own views, of the lack of an ultimate truth to what we think, what we say. I mean, I sometimes try to say things with a lot of authority because, I mean, if I don't teach with authority, people won't listen to me anymore. But sometimes I go back home and start doing research and study, and I find, hey, maybe I was wrong there. So it helps to admit that, I think, through indeed being continuously critically self-reflective, which also means the more critically self-reflective we are, the more we are autonomous. We are real self-determining citizens. I think one problem with autocratic ideas is that people, they sort of absorb the idea that they need to be led by someone, that they want to be subjects because actually democratic freedom is too difficult for them. And so they rather have a strong leader. That's the opposite of autonomy. A difficult term for that is heteronomy, not making your own decision. So the exact opposite of the video we saw, where people say, hey, wait a minute, they might be discussing this in the Senate, but I bump in and I say, well, listen to me too, because I also have my rights, I have my needs, etc. And so autonomy, self-determination is very important, but always with the mindset that allows us to think, but also other people are self-determining, and so we need to respect them. So there's the individual part. We need to instill people individual values and help them self-reflect, help them becoming autonomous, but they also always need to factor in the collective dimension. How do you do that in a collective setting? And this makes me think of the democratic activist work I do. I'm not sure how many of you are active in NGOs or so. Could I have some hands here? Are people members or volunteers in? Oh, well, that's a good amount of. So you probably recognize that working with other people, particularly in settings where it's more voluntary, it's in your free time, it's very difficult to do democracy, to make together democratic decisions is very, very difficult. But it's necessary. It's something you need to learn. It's something that you only learn on the ground. It's great, of course, to do simulations like we saw in the other video, in the open in Belgium, the cafe types of fantastic, but I think it's even better to learn it in real life. What does it mean to be democratically? One thing it does mean is that you lose, well, at least in my case, at least 10, 15 hours a week of your free time, which is often in the evening, doing democracy, being active, having your Zoom calls with people all over Europe, preparing campaigns, press releases, petitions to the parliament, and so on. And so there's a strong collective dimension there, indeed, that includes forms of civil society involvement, which can mean all kinds of things, and it includes, indeed, putting into practice those democratic norms. Sometimes it doesn't work. I mean, doing democracy also means creating enemies in a way, or creating discontent. That's part of the story. And so that means that maybe we need to think in a more comprehensive way about what European citizenship education should be about. It's surely, as we also clearly see in the Erasmus Plus program and also in its new edition for 2028 onwards, I think, a strong emphasis on the promotion of European Union values. But my argument today would be we need to actually do a little bit more. We need to put those values in their very complex, turbulent, contemporary context, which means we need to think about how can we convince people that those very values are actually antidotes to forms of being non-autonomous, being manipulated by others, being tricked into certain messages like migrants are always the problems for any kind of problem. And so it's our antidote against being manipulated. And it's incredibly easy nowadays to be manipulated with AI, and I'll come back to that in a second. And this is, for me, the most emotional important part. These are antidotes against the hardness and the coldness of many of those radical, let's say, anti-civil positions. And this is what I find so disconcerting. And so I might be a university professor, blah, 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 but I'm also a human being. And looking around me, seeing societies like in the US, where the hardness and the coldness and the being tough, but not being human, not being sentimental, emotional to others, is increasingly the way of doing things. And I find this really scary. And I find this really sad. I thought we had learned the other way, that it's being soft to others, that it's being inclusive, that it's accepting weaknesses, etc. That's not being cold, but being warm towards other beings. That's what we're in all this for, right? That's also what Erasmus is about. It's about collaborating. We know how extremely difficult it is, especially also across boundaries, between cultures, etc. And so we need to think about how do we do that? How do we get the coldness out of it? Even if it's getting colder in temperature out there, how we can still keep the warmness amongst people in political, democratic forms of interaction. And so that means all kinds of things. We need to think about how can we steer people towards forms of participation that matter, that are healthy in a way, that are not aggressive against other people, etc. And so that's the quality of participation. Why do people participate? How do they do that? With what kind of message? And then secondly also, we need to think about how can we create as many spaces, occasions, as possible, as necessary to allow for that type of participation to emerge. And there, I guess, the digital is not unimportant. I basically became, right before the pandemic, I became more interested in doing more democratic activist stuff, and then the pandemic hit in, and a lot of the democratic stuff turned online. So Zoom is now my main platform for being democratically engaged, which is fine, I think. It resolves an enormous amount of problems. And so digital space is something to factor in and to use and to build out in different ways and to make it human, as has been said before. But also it's difficult to do that, and we also need to think carefully, we'll come back to that, about the downsides. And just to show you a number of things, I mean, on the right there you see, of course, peace is one huge project where we all help creating this space, this democratic participatory space, in all kinds of different contexts, schools, higher education, voluntary activities, etc. But I also wanted to do some, to highlight some other projects where CTDEM is a project I coordinate at the University of Bologna. It's so-called SERVE money from the Cultural and Values funding of the European Commission. There's 2 universities in our project and 10 NGOs or so. Also there I learn on the ground how difficult democratic participation is. But it's all about creating assemblies, creating moments for young people in particular to deliberate, to be democratically active, etc. There's a third one, a big one that just sort of finished its project, the so-called Democratic Odyssey, where they equally did this in a number of European cities like Athens, Florence, and other places. And so this is, I think, the way we need to go forward, to think about the more spaces we create where open discussion, deliberation is possible, the more we manage to, hopefully, to get this, yeah, I need to wrap up, to get a democratic mindset into people's behavior and heads. And very briefly, indeed, I sometimes feel, but you might beg to differ, that what we often do with citizenship education is much too individualistic. It's much too about that individuals need to absorb certain values. I think there could be also more of a collective dimension to this. And so that also means that I guess the core question remains with us, okay, we have these EU values, but let's take them in a dynamic way. Ultimately, they are about what kind of European society do we really want to live in? Is it a European set of a Europe of nations with closed borders, we don't interact with foreigners because we don't like them? Or is it increasing European collaboration? These are just 2 of the options in a way. But I need to go a bit faster, so I will go to the digital part. Just briefly about European citizenship education. I think indeed it's about knowledge, it's about individual values and experience, and it's about practice, being actively involved in actual projects. But that brings me to the final part, and I nicely noticed that it's in line with at least 2 of the major, of the 4 focal points of Erasmus+. Issues about forms of digital literacy, social media literacy, and AI literacy, which I think is particularly important. And so social media, to give you an example, as part of digital citizenship, are clearly there. I mean, if you look with surveys with young people, they get most of their political information from social media. And so they're extremely important as a source of information and knowledge, but also of participation. A lot of young people, again, they argue, online at least I can participate. In the real political world, they don't listen to me, I'm not visible, there are no political parties for young people, etc. But we also need to factor in that the very same social media are a major problem with regard to diffusion of autocratic, illiberal ideas, attacking democracy, persuading, manipulating people into ideas that may be very far from reality, from hard facts, etc. Indeed, research shows that people with already intolerant attitude, young people with an intolerant attitude in ordinary life, are more active politically online than other young people. And that's something to think about. What do we do with that? Artificial intelligence, one of the main things I'm interested nowadays, because I see a lot of problems at the university emerging, so I thought I might as well get to understand what it is about. On the one hand, of course, it's a great tool, particularly what they call generative artificial intelligence. It may help us inform ourselves, summarize, as somebody asked before as well, information. It is about tools of creating information, but it's also about tools of creating fake news. It produces hallucination. It produces slop. Just think of that video that Trump apparently created after the so-called No King's Day in the US, and I'm not sure if you've seen that. I don't think that's a kind of healthy usage of AI in terms of inclusiveness in politics. And this brings me to the end of the talk. There's a lot to be thought through in the usage of generative AI like ChatGPT. Do we want to become dependent on external information producing things like ChatGPT, or do we rather want to develop our own brains? There's psychological research that shows that the more you use ChatGPT, the less you develop your own brain. There goes your critical thinking. At a certain stage, you don't have the tools in your head anymore to be critical. That's, I think, highly concerning. And that goes also with a lot of the other dimensions on this list here. AI is not always accurate, as we know. AI can't judge. AI doesn't have values. It doesn't know the truth. It can say very scary things. The human factor is going out of the window. What is also a problem, AI produces, ruins the environment, but creates things that maybe we don't need. Maybe they don't help us in our participatory life, for instance. And this is my last slide, I promise, because otherwise the facilitator will kick me off the stage. I think these three things should at least be core to our participatory strategies. That is indeed digital literacy, people knowing what the digital tools are about, how they work, how easily they can be used and abused. That's a first step, but more specifically, social media literacy and AI literacy. And let me briefly, on the ultimate note, go into the AI literacy. I think this is dramatically important. AI, for instance, artificial intelligence, is really nothing about intelligence. AI is not intelligent. AI cuts up words into pieces in the so-called process of tokenization, and then it starts on the basis of statistics, predicting what might come after that piece of word. That's the complete opposite of human way of thinking. Humans tell each other stories. Humans make sense out of our lives by means of narratives, of stories. AI doesn't do that. And so I think we should keep that in mind. And so that's also in our educational work and other work. It's about stories. It's not about probability or prediction of big data set produced knowledge. I keep it to that because it could go on for another hour on Gen AI, but let's leave it. Thank you so much, and I hope you got at least some kind of thing out of my talk.